There is a version of the human body that lives in textbooks. Light goes to the eyes, touch stays at the skin, hearing goes to the ears. It is tidy, it is teachable, and most days it's good enough. But there is also the body that people meet in real life from time to time, when you can tell someone is watching you even before you turn around, when a room has tension you can feel, even if no one says a word. And in the stories we're about to get into, when people claim they can take that sensitivity and train it into something that sounds impossible. This episode is about a very specific claim, reading without using the eyes, and what happens when you hold it up to both versions of the body at once. I know when most of you hear the claim, you probably already decided it was fraud, fantasy, a misunderstanding, wishful thinking. But before you decide, let's try to keep an open mind and look at what the world of science has to say about whether the human body has any way to detect light that does not involve the eyes. And honestly, between you and me, I thought that would be a hard no, that my research would end there and I would move on to my next idea. But, spoiler, that is not what I found. Because in the last couple of decades, researchers noticed things they couldn't easily explain. Inflammatory responses changing depending on wavelength, healing and repair looking different depending on timing and conditions. It seemed the body was responding to light based on intensity and wavelength, and they assumed at the time it involved the visual system. But they needed to test this. And when they did, they decided to remove the eyes from the equation and see if the skin still responded. They studied the skin in isolation. They controlled the light, the wavelength, the timing, and they wanted to know whether the same responses would occur. And they did, which meant that whatever was happening did not require vision. So researchers then went looking for the mechanism that was creating these results. And they found opsins. Opsins are a family of light responsive proteins best known for their role in the retina. In the eye, opsins respond to incoming light and trigger signaling inside cells, an early step in the chain that becomes vision. Finding opsin in the skin does not mean the skin can see like the eyes, but it does mean light sensitivity is not locked inside the visual system. Since then, multiple types of opsins have been reported in human skin cells. When activated by light, these proteins can trigger intracellular signaling, and different opsins are sensitive to different ranges of light. The skin is not reacting blindly. It is responding with specificity. From there, researchers began mapping what these pathways might be doing. Some describe opsins as direct sensors translating wavelength into biological instructions. Others describe them more as modulators, tuning systems that are already running. But that disagreement is about the description, not about the underlying point. Because once you know the body can respond to light outside the eyes, reading without sight stops sounding like pure fantasy and becomes a question you can at least entertain testing. And testing is exactly what happened in the 1800s. In Paris, reading without using the eyes was becoming common enough and loud enough that a serious challenge was put on the table. A member of the Academy of Medicine named Bourdon offered 3,000 francs to anyone who could read without using sight. The money was deposited with a notary under the order of the Academy, and a committee was appointed to supervise the experiments. We have a committee, a notary, a prize on the table, and a room full of people trying to decide what they're witnessing. And then comes a part that feels strangely modern. Some contestants appeared to meet the challenge. Believers celebrated. On the other end, skeptics pushed back just as hard, arguing that ordinary sight or a loophole had not been truly excluded. In the end, no prize money was awarded, but the story matters because it shows how common these claims were. By the 20th century, the claim starts living as a category. In some circles, it even gets a label, dermo-optical perception. And with that label comes a new sense that whatever is happening is not just a superpower that switches on. It is more like a skill that can appear under training and practice. In the 1960s, one name shows up again and again as the hinge point where this starts becoming a modern controversy: Rosa Kuleshova. Not because she was the first person to claim it, but because the reports around her are concrete, with specific demonstrations that people could describe, repeat, and, of course, argue over. This unfolded in the Soviet Union in settings where physicians and researchers observed what was happening. In the accounts that survive, Rosa is often described with her eyes covered and starting with something basic and building from there: light versus dark at close range, then higher contrast differences, then color cards on paper, and eventually large shapes, single letters, and numbers. And then the claim that turned her into a headline: she could read printed words without using her eyes. Some accounts place the sensing at her fingertips or palms. Other retellings place it on broader skin surfaces, even an elbow. She became associated with Soviet blindfold vision experiments, and soon her abilities went on display. Her demonstrations were presented as repeatable enough to be observed and disputed. So, could she have been seen with her skin? Well, we know now the skin is not passive. It is an organ that responds to light in a structured way. But whether this was legitimate or trickery, she made a name for herself, and the label dermo-optical perception traveled with the story. Then this claim began to spread, mutate, and reappear in China this time. Here, the claim not only takes on a new form, but it becomes a modern news story with a whole country trying to decide what is real. One of the most repeated stories in this phenomenon centers on an 11-year-old boy named Tang Yu. Tang and his friend Chen are walking home from school in a remote part of Sichuan in Dazhou County, and they start wrestling. In the story as it is told, Tang brushes against his friend's coat pocket and suddenly describes two Chinese characters. His friend then pulls out a cigarette pack, and the label on the side is said to match the exact two characters Tang described. And that is the moment Tang's story begins, because after that, it's not just one lucky hit. It becomes an experience for himself and the villagers. They write characters on small pieces of paper, crumple them into tight balls, and Tang holds each one near his ear. And the claim is that he can identify what is written inside, not by uncrumpling it, not by peeking, just by holding it there. In the reporting from that period, the story expands fast. Local commissions and education officials are said to examine him. Reporters show up, party officials show up, and the claim, at least in the way it was publicly framed, was not just that he could guess symbols, but that he could identify words and even colors on those small pieces of paper. The story hits a major newspaper in 1979, and from there, the flood starts. Because once one child becomes a headline, the country starts finding more. And the claims diversify. Not just ear reading, now we have finger, palm, scalp, abdomen, feet. And people were not just saying, I sense something, they were saying, I can tell you what is written. They were saying it in a way that forced the world to choose between two uncomfortable possibilities. Either something real and strange was happening, or a lot of people were being fooled in a very human way. And this did not stay in the shadows. The reporting describes conferences, journal attention, and a period in the early 1980s where interest became loud enough that large meetings are being held around what Chinese researchers were calling extraordinary functions of the human body. And then inside that wave, you get a second kind of story. In one set of reports, two sisters are tested with paper carrying Chinese symbols placed on the skin, first openly and then in later runs inside sealed envelopes, with high success rates reported by the researchers involved. And right alongside that is a detail that makes the whole thing feel more grounded and more complicated at the same time. Some reports describe limits. In one experiment, the children are said to perform well with targets and colors, but fail when conditions move toward total darkness. Now, one interpretation is that the whole thing is simply misdirection, cueing, contamination, and the like. The other is that if some portion of it depends on light still being present in the environment, then the claim may make sense. It may be a weird edge case of perception where light plus body plus training produces something that feels like seeing. The claim got big enough to attract institutions, conferences, and demonstrations. That became social events. And also constant argument over whether the phenomenon was real or whether people are simply learning how to perform inside the gaps. Either way, the moment is a cultural shift. There may be perception that is trainable. And then when that happens, this becomes irresistible to another kind of world entirely, the world of programs, rumors, and intelligence interests. And that is where we go next, when curiosity becomes funding. Because in the Cold War era, the question was not simply whether a claim was true. It was whether it was spreading, whether other people were believing it, whether the intelligence community could use that belief, and what it would mean if even a small part of it held up. U.S. intelligence agencies collected and circulated reporting on the Chinese wave, including Tang Yu and other reports of exceptional abilities of the human body. The claim had grown large enough to become paperwork. In the same era, defense and intelligence summaries tracked Soviet and Eastern Bloc work in the same general neighborhood, filed under terms like psychoenergetics and psychotronics. The tone is almost always cautious and managerial. Less wonder, more strategy. Written in that careful way that says, we do not know, but we don't want to be surprised. The U.S. did not only read foreign reports, partly because Cold War logic does not let you ignore a rumored edge, even if you suspect the rumor is wrong. This is where names like Grill Flame enter the lineage that later gets remembered under Stargate, with remote viewing, of course, being its most famous thread. Now, even though remote viewing is not the same claim as blindfold reading, the deeper question is the same one we've been tracing all along. Can perception operate outside the channels we assume it is limited to? And when a claim reaches that level, it does not disappear when institutions lose interest. They diffuse outward into private training, informal tests, and small communities that keep trying long after the documents stop circulating. Step forward a few decades, and now you can find this claim showing up in workshops, family routines, and small communities that treat this as a teachable skill. You can find people comparing methods, describing progressions from light versus dark, contrasts, and shapes, sharing what helped, what failed, and what seemed to change with practice. And if you have any sources, stories, or experiences related to this, share them in the comments. I can't wait to read them. Let's get back to the question we started with. Can the skin detect light in a structured way that could be trained into something that feels like seeing? And does that make the historical reports easier to understand? The honest answer is that the biology makes this question less ridiculous than it used to be. Skin is not passive. It responds to light through real pathways. The skin is treating light as information outside the eyes. At the same time, these claims live in a zone that is notoriously hard to test. Blindfold work is easy to contaminate. Tiny leaks, reflections, and unintentional cues that can create the illusion of something extraordinary. And that means the biggest demonstrations will always attract believers and skeptics. But I want to zoom out for a minute and point something out. All the patterns we have seen across the centuries, they don't claim a miracle. It's more of a training claim with the ladder of difficulty where calm helps and pressure breaks it. And if you ask me, that is exactly what a fragile perceptional skill would look like. Whether the signal is truly unusual or whether it is the nervous system learning to read ordinary information, I'm not sure, but it certainly deserves more research. The boundary between the body and the world may be more trainable than we think, If you've made it this far, I would love to know what you think. What felt the most possible? What felt impossible? And if you enjoy science at the edge and beyond, please join the community. We sure would love to have you. Make sure you set your notifications because next we are going to explore magnetism and the body. Until then, take care.